Let's begin by reading again. Let's read starting in verse 17, the Passover with the disciples, since we actually didn't get very far in the Passover with the disciples last week. Then we'll read the Last Supper verses, which we should start to get into tonight. Then we'll stop at the end of the Last Supper in verse 29. So, chapter 26, verse 17. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to such a one and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he sat at table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" He answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Is it I, Master?" He said to him, "You have said so." Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." And he took a chalice, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I shall not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So we were discussing last week whether the meal is a Passover meal, or which is to say whether it's on the evening of 15 Nisan, or whether it's the day before Passover on the evening of 14 Nisan. And so we concluded that it's on the evening of 14 Nisan, so that Jesus is crucified and dies on the afternoon of 14 Nisan, the following afternoon, which is just at the same time that the Passover lambs are being sacrificed in the temple. Notice Jesus sits at the table with the 12, and Matthew makes it a point of mentioning that he does it with the 12 disciples. So it's very much an Exodus typology. Let's take a look at Exodus chapter 24, verses 3-6. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. And he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Let's read through verse 8. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood and threw it upon the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So the 12 tribes of Israel, the blood of the covenant, which we're going to see again in a little bit in the Last Supper. So this is, Jesus is celebrating this the day before the Passover, but it still really is a Passover meal. And the Passover is a family meal. So the implication here is that Jesus is celebrating Passover with his disciples who are his family. So his spiritual family is a replacement for his physical family, which is what he had said earlier in chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brethren stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother, and who are my brethren?" And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brethren. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." At the same time, it mentions the 12, but it's also possible that there were other people present, particularly the women who had followed from Galilee. So we have the betrayal, and in some sense, we can see the betrayal as, does everyone remember the parable of the wheat and the tares and the parable of the good and bad fish? So the parable of the wheat and the tares is in chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. Then he left the parable of the wheat and the tares is in two parts, starting at chapter 13, verse 24, and then continue through 30, and then continuing at 36 through 43. Another parable he put before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the householder came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then has it weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" Then the explanation in verse 36, "Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field.' He answered, 'He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed means the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." And then the parable of the good and the bad fish is a bit later in verse 47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net which was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into vessels, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So these are kingdom of heaven parables. And they're kingdom of heaven parables in the sense that the kingdom of heaven is a present reality. So the kingdom of heaven is the church. And in the kingdom of heaven, as a present reality, in the kingdom of heaven as the church, are mixed the good and the evil. So simply being in the church doesn't necessarily mean one isn't evil. And so we see an enactment of that at the Passover meal and among the 12 disciples, that one of Jesus' disciples is indeed a servant of the evil one, has betrayed Jesus. So previously, Jesus had said that he would be delivered, but now he makes it clear that he's betrayed, that he'll be handed over by one of his own disciples, which provokes immediate horror among the disciples. It's made worse by the fact that they're eating together, since sharing table indicates a certain level of intimacy. That's why Jesus is accused of associating with sinners and sharing the table with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors, because eating together indicates a level of intimacy. And Jesus was sharing a certain level of intimacy with people who were sinners and outcasts. So it's shocking that he would be betrayed by one of his intimate circle. So there's a contrast here between Jesus says, the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. There's a contrast between Jesus, who goes as is written of him, and Judas, who is disobedient. That's even reflected in the way that Judas addresses Jesus. So the disciples ask one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" Kyrios, which is how Jesus' disciples and followers address him. Judas says, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Is it I, teacher? Which is how Jesus asked not to be addressed, since you have only one teacher. So in John's gospel, only non-disciples address Jesus as teacher. So Judas is both indicating his disobedience and disrespect toward Jesus, and also he's indicating that he really isn't one of the 12 disciples, or he isn't really a true disciple. So why do the disciples ask, "Is it I, Lord?"
Maybe they're not sure what they did wrong.
Yeah, or they're not sure what they're going to do wrong.
But also because Jesus know more than they do.
Uh-huh. Right. That's another thing. Jesus knows more than they do. So they're wondering if it's them who, if each of them is the one who will betray Jesus, even though, they don't necessarily have plans to do so, but Jesus knows more than they do. So I think it's both of those things, because it's also, true that they're, as we're going to see, as events unfold, their faith is weak and their faith fails them. Peter betrays, or doesn't betray, but denies Jesus, and then everybody runs away. So, um, so we can see the beginning of that here as they're eating the Passover dinner. And Jesus answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me."
Haven't they all done that?
Yeah, they've all done that. But it's also prophetic, and it's also in some sense symbolic. So even though they've all done it, it has a special reference to only one other person, the betrayer. So uh, it's a fulfillment of Psalm 41, verse 9. Let's take a look. Actually, let's read the whole psalm. Blessed is he who considers the poor. The Lord delivers him in the day of trouble. The Lord protects him and keeps him alive. He is called blessed in the land. You do not give him up to the will of his enemies. The Lord sustains him on his sickbed. In his illness, you heal all his infirmities. As for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me. Heal me, for I have sinned against you. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish? When one comes to see me, he utters empty words, while his heart gathers mischief. When he goes out, he tells it abroad. All who hate me whisper together about me. They imagine the worst for me. They say, a deadly thing has fastened upon him. He will not rise again from where he lies. And here is the prophetic verse. Even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted his heel against me. But you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up that I may repay them. By this I know that you are pleased with me and that my enemy has not triumphed over me. But you have upheld me because of my integrity and set me in your presence forever. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Amen and amen. So even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted his heel against me. So that's prophetic. Then there's a symbolism that the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl, the bowl contains haricet, which is a sauce made with fruit, nuts, ginger or cinnamon, and wine or vinegar. And so you dip in it bitter herbs. That's part of the Passover celebration. And it symbolizes the bitterness of slavery and bondage in Israel. So here it begins to take on a new meaning. First of all, for Jesus, it represents the anguish of, symbolizes the anguish of betrayal by an intimate friend. but it also symbolizes the bond of betrayed and betrayer together, since both will die, and both will experience the anguish of death, and both experience the anguish of betrayal. Jesus, right now, when he is prophesying about the betrayal by Judas, and Judas, when he begins to feel remorse for his betrayal. So the bowl is a symbol of suffering, and both Jesus and Judas are bound together in their suffering. Questions about that?
Yeah, well, not a question, but Jesus is suffering because he knows that he must die for the fulfillment to free us of our sin. But
He's also suffering because he's been betrayed, and that's painful. He's been betrayed by one of his most intimate
well, there's going to
disciples.
be a few things happening at the,
Right.
after this. But with Judas, what kind of suffering was he doing? It wasn't it only after he
It's
realized
only
he did that?
after,
Yeah,
but
okay.
nevertheless, he will
It
be
is something.
united in suffering with Christ
Mm.
for very different reasons.
Well, yeah. One
But
goes to the,
nevertheless, united in suffering.
Mm. Okay.
I mean, obviously, there's judgment for Judas, although, there is a whole debate about whether Judas repented and is, saved or whatever, which, seems like a whatever it is, rat's hole or whatever the phrase is, that not something that is worth thinking about. So the Son of Man goes as is written of him. There's no particular, this is unusual because Matthew really likes to cite the scriptures that have been fulfilled. And here he merely has a non-specific scriptural reference. So as is written of him. So what might he have in mind? And speaking of his death, he's earlier said in chapter 16 that he will suffer and be killed. In chapter 20, he said that he's come to serve, not to be served, but to serve and to be a ransom for many. Matthew has earlier also given the fulfillment quotation from Psalm 118 about Jesus being the cornerstone. And so any idea of what Matthew might have in mind here? Suffering and being killed, ransom for many. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
Is it for the faith?
What?
He's done this for the faith, for everyone to have faith in who he is.
Yeah, but what Old Testament verse, what part of the Old Testament, what Old Testament prophecy does that fulfill? What is likely Matthew referring to here?
The suffering. Oh my gosh, what is the name of the suffering servant?
The suffering servant.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Isaiah chapter 53, particularly. So let's look at a suffering servant. We'll read the whole chapter. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, and they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When he makes himself an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the fruit of the travail of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So the suffering servant who bears the sins of many. So this identifies Jesus with the suffering servant. It also once again indicates that since Jesus is recognizing, saying that he goes as is written of him, that the events of the Passion are not and have not taken him by surprise. He's fully aware of them. And he pronounces woe and condemnation, therefore, upon Judas. So we've talked about this last week and also earlier on one occasion, that this is an expression of the biblical paradox that evil can only accomplish what God has already foreseen, and that what happens according to the declared will of God is also a free and responsible human act. So the human who is an agent of God isn't spared good judgment for committing evil. So in a lot of ways, it reflects what Jesus had said earlier, that he said it in chapter 18, verse 7, which we don't have to turn to, but he said, it's necessary that temptations come, but woe to the man by whom the temptations come. So temptations will come, but you don't want to be the agent who brings the temptations because you'll be judged accordingly.
You also want to resist the temptations.
You also want to resist the temptations, right? Lead us not to tempt into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So that's the end of the preparations for the Passover and the betrayal. So we can start the Last Supper. So this is a Passover meal. And the Passover meal. So there are two major views of the Last Supper. One, that it's to be understood literally. That's the view taken by Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, in fact, all of the pre-Reformation churches. It's to be the view also taken by Lutherans, and it's the view taken by some Anglicans. Then the other view is that it's symbolic. And so Jesus is being metaphorical. This is my body, this is my blood, is metaphor. The is means represents. And so we're remembering Christ's sacrifice, and we're in communion. We're participating in a fellowship meal that expresses our unity as a people of God. So what I wanted to do is to start with the notion of remembrance, although it's not, it's in Paul's Last Supper verse, but it's not here. But nevertheless, the Passover meal is a memorial. I think it's chapter 12 of Exodus. Let's look at chapter 12 of Exodus. It is verse 14. Our separated brethren say that the Last Supper is a memorial. So what we want to do is understand what a memorial is. So chapter 12, verse 14. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as an ordinance forever. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened, from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an ordinance forever. So this day is used in both verse 14 and 17. And that's significant because this day is this day. It's the day that's being commemorated, and it's made present and real. We can see that very clearly in the Passover, during the Passover meal. After the second cup is drunk, there's an exchange between the youngest person present and the leader or the oldest male, the host. So the youngest person asks, why is this night different from all other nights? So notice this night different from all other nights. The night that we're commemorating is this night. The past event is brought into the present. Past event is made present and real. So why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights, we either eat leavened bread or matzah. But on this night, we eat only matzah. On all other nights, we eat vegetables and herbs of all kinds. Why on this night do we eat bitter herbs especially? On all other nights, we never think of dipping even once. Why on this night do we dip twice? On all other nights, everyone sits up straight at the table. Why on this night do we all recline? Then the leader answers, this night is very different from all other nights, because on this night we celebrate one of the most important events in the history of our people. They're going forth in triumph from servitude to freedom. So this night is the current night. This night is a past night that's brought into the present. It also points to the future. The Passover ceremony after the destruction of the temple ends with, I'll see you next year in Jerusalem, so that God's people will be reunited, called back from the diaspora, reunited in Jerusalem. So the important thing, the Greek word for this is anamnesis, memorial, in memory. And so it takes us as participants back to the original event that we're commemorating. It brings it into our present and it takes it into the future. That's the meaning of anamnesis. So it's the event that creates the memory, not the memory that recalls the event. We have that completely backwards. So the event, our separated brethren, it's in fact not even completely in Calvinist theology. Calvin understands anamnesis to mean that we become observers at the original event. It's not brought into our present. It's not taken into a future. It's simply a past event that is made real for us. So he has 1/3 of the understanding of anamnesis, at least. But for our separated brethren, our evangelical and fundamentalist brethren, it's merely a remembering, a remembrance, a fond memory. We think back and thank Jesus for what he's done, which, we should do, but that's really not, that's necessary, but that's totally insufficient. So that's a subjective state, I'm thankful, Jesus, what a guy, go Jesus, big of him, whatever. That's just not adequate. That's the memory that recalls the event. And that memory is a subjective state. And the reality is that subjective states are not very important. Our subjective state is ultimately not very important. What is important is the event. So the event creates the memory. We are taken back to the event. That event is brought forward. And then where does the Last Supper point to?
When they had to leave Egypt.
That's pointing back, really. We're pointing forward.
Okay.
To the Eucharist and to the heavenly banquet, right?
Right. And it also points to the cross
To the cross.
and the resurrection. Because his body has not yet been broken and his blood has not been yet poured out. So it's a prophetic enactment. So it points forward to the cross and resurrection, points forward to the Eucharist, and points forward to the heavenly banquet. So anamnesis always has that past, present, and future dimension. That's true in Judaism, that's true in it's true in traditional Christianity.
But like one thing that I got very confused before I understand that, like, like the Holy Communion is not like a memory, it is Christ. It is like not like a symbol, it is Christ.
Right.
What's the definition of memory today?
The definition of memory has changed. We've lost that sense of anamnesis. But the problem is, that we're bound not by our understanding, but by the understanding of Judaism, first of all, and the understanding of Christ and the understanding of the early church. And so once we begin to change the meaning of words, we begin to, sort of get into, we begin to lose Jesus' teaching and the teaching of the church. So one example, for example, is in the creed, I believe in one God. Believe means something different than it used to mean. Believe used to mean that I ascribe to an external truth. So my belief has nothing to do with my opinion. Opinions are, not relevant here. There is an external truth. There is one God, and I ascribe to that. The one God exists independently of me. There is one God. Whether I, think so or not, whatever my opinion might be of it, whatever my opinion might be of that one God, there is one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. That's a truth. That's an external truth. That has nothing to do with me.
And that has past, present, and future in it?
No, that doesn't.
Oh.
But I'm just saying that's an example of something that's changed. The meaning of the word believe has changed. it used to mean something that is objectively true and external to me. So my opinion had nothing to do with it. But now if we look at the meaning of believe today, it's tied up with our opinion and our subjective state, right? So I believe in Santa Claus. I believe in the
As a
Easter
child.
Bunny. I believe in one God. I believe that the election was stolen. Those are all, subjective opinions, but we're not called on to have subjective opinions. We're called to ascribe to external truth. And if we think it's a subjective opinion, then what happens is that we end up creating the image of God. God has to, my opinion validates God. And that's heretical. That's totally in contradiction to the teaching of the fathers. So similarly, anamnesis, it becomes, we live in a subjective age where our subjective state is, considered to be important. And unfortunately, in many ways, especially among our separated brethren, our subjective state is, critically important in many ways, far more than, the subjectivity of secular society. So when we have the memory, which is subjective, that recalls the event becomes subjective. The event loses its meaning and begins to have whatever meaning we choose to attach to it. Like, oh, that Jesus, what a guy. Yeah. So
Yeah, I think that's very important to understand the whole concept, like the definition of memory that's different. That's not what we understand today. It's now like, yeah, that's crucial
right,
to understand the whole thing.
right. So the memory, the event creates the memory. When we remember, it's not that we have this thing and it's that the event is real. The event exists independently and outside of us. Anamnesis takes us back to that event, makes us participants in the event, brings that event from the past into our present.
And that is
So
also the truth.
it's also the truth, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Christ is present in the Eucharist. The event is his death and resurrection as enacted, pre-enacted at the Last Supper. That's a reality that's brought into our present. Christ is present at the Eucharist. We are present at the Last Supper. And that in turn is taken forward into an even more profound and greater reality, to the heavenly banquet, which is our ultimate hope. The heavenly banquet is more real than our world. And we pray that we will be seated with all the saints and with all the angels and with all of our beloved dead at the heavenly banquet, at the table with our Lord. So there's nothing, subjective about this. There's no element of subjectivity. This is, This is real, and this is objective. It's not, soft and fuzzy. Nothing soft and fuzzy here. It's real, it's objective, it's truth. Are there any questions about anamnesis? It's it's a concept that is, very not exactly something that we're used to, because we tend to sort of see this all as subjective, and I'm remembering and do this in memory, and isn't that nice? And that's really not what it is at all, and not what it ever has been. I mean, it's not that it's what it's become. And that becoming is, not a good thing. That becoming, what I was going to say, earlier, and I didn't say, and I guess we should probably close with that, is that there are some continuities in Judaism that we have to enforce, and so if we look at the liturgy, large parts of the liturgy are sort of inherited from Judaism and worship in the temple. If we look at the notion of anamnesis is both a Jewish and a Greek one, and it comes to us from Judaism. It comes to us from the Passover is an anamnesis. We're taken back to the actual event of the Passover. It's brought into our present, and it takes us into the future. When we lose those connections, we become a religion that's discontinuous, completely discontinuous, a whole new phenomenon from Judaism that has no roots in Judaism. And that means, in turn, that it has no roots in Christ.
Okay.
Because Christ was a Jew. And much of Judaism continues into Christianity. The basis of Christianity is Judaism. So Christ doesn't abolish Judaism. He doesn't abolish the law and the prophets. He fulfills them and takes the law and the prophets to a higher level. If you undercut the lower level, then a higher level falls down and you have nothing. It's a sort of fundamental historical concept that's something that the new thing grows out of the old thing and preserves many of the characteristics of the old thing while transforming them. If we simply change them, forget about them, then we have something completely new that's not based on the old. And what that something new is always called is a heresy. You had asked a question last week. You had made a comment about the Sabbath and Sunday, and I somehow didn't respond and wasn't really thinking. But so the Sabbath contrasts sharply with, or Sunday contrasts sharply with the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is a commemoration of God's creation activity in creating the world. So on the seventh day, he rested. It's a celebration of the perfection of creation and God's work of the previous 6 days. Day 7 is necessarily followed by 1, which is the beginning of a new creation through Christ. So in that sense, 7 is the beginning of a whole new creation. 8 or 1 is the beginning of a whole new creation. That's the Sunday, the day that we celebrate as the Lord's Day, not the Sabbath, because we're disciples of Christ. And so in the early church, Christians who continued to celebrate the Sabbath were viewed as heretical, because it was really a denial of the divinity of Christ and the denial of Christ bringing a new covenant and the denial of it being a new creation for God's people. And unfortunately today, Sabbath worship is beginning to come back. The Seventh-day Adventists celebrate the Sabbath, and many evangelical Christians are also beginning to. Here again, that's a sharp break with early Christianity and with the teaching of the fathers.